Good afternoon and welcome to the September 24th, 2025 Q&A Virtual Lunch Hour. I'm your host, Jason Killeen. I just want to remind folks that we've already started the 2026 renewal process. Businesses are able to update and renew their records through the portal. We do also have an online payment option through the LA tax system once the renewal records have been submitted. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and get into a brief formal presentation over the renewal process and what some of the options are before we get into the questions. So during our 2026 license renewal period, we will allow for businesses to submit various modification requests outside of the standard modification process. And if there are any additional fees that would be assessed, we would go ahead and notify the business. But for a lot of the modifications, additional fees will not be assessed as we review your renewal record. Modifications that cannot be submitted during the 2026 renewal period are relocations, entity substitutions, 100% ownership changes, and social equity ownership changes that trigger an equity share review. For the first three, relocations, entity substitutions, and 100% ownership changes, all three of those trigger new records and require you to pay new application fees. And then for the fourth one, if an ownership change does trigger a new social equity review, that review triggers the equity share review fee. So that would be above and beyond what would be part of the renewal review process. So please be aware of that. The modifications that are allowed are limited changes to ownership, equity changes between existing owners, bringing on new owners that don't require us to do an equity share review, updates to the business premises diagrams, adding fictitious business names, also known as DBAs, removing cannabis activities. The renewal period gives businesses the opportunity to submit some of these modification requests to us. And as we review and update other contact types for neighborhood liaisons, consultants, law firms, et cetera, on the record, it gives us the ability to make sure that the legal business entity record is consistent with the application records based on the 4008 forms submitted. So, please use this as an opportunity to make sure that DCR has the most up-to-date information for your entity and for that specific location. And if staff have any questions or they see discrepancies between your records, they'll go ahead and reach out and ask you to provide additional information or cure those deficiencies. So to trigger a limited change in ownership, we have some questions. And we have a series of yes/no questions on the document. You can see the arrow at the top is asking you to confirm whether or not your ownership information is current. If you say yes, you won't be asked to submit an updated LIC 4008 form, which is the legal business entity record disclosure form. If you select no, you'll be prompted to upload that form, and that will trigger a staff review of the form and compare it to your legal business entity record. If there's no updates to owners and direct owners, primary personnel, financial interest holders, but there are updates to contact-specific records like your neighborhood liaison, a consultant, a law firm, etc., the second yellow arrow you can see down there is asking you to confirm your other contacts. If you say yes, your contacts are up to date, you won't be prompted to submit any information. If you select no, you'll be prompted to identify additional contacts and or remove contacts that are on the record. And you have the additional updates, you have the opportunity using a text box to describe what kinds of changes need to be made. In the sample we have on the screen, it says additional information for modification. And once you get through the questions, you'll go ahead and click continue. Based on your yes/no answers, that's going to trigger the document uploads. So you can see, in addition to the standard LIC 4025 form, you're being asked to submit the updated LIC 4008 form and LIC 4004 modification form. So those will be added to the dropdown. If you say yes to the questions, you won't be prompted to upload those documents. For business premises changes, that's the third yes, no question on the screen. You can see where the yellow arrow is. If you say yes, it's current, you won't be prompted to update a new business premises diagram. If you say no, it's not current, then you will be prompted to upload the new form. And as you can see here, the screenshot shows the standard LIC 4025 form, which has to be submitted by all businesses completing the renewal process. But here, only the business premises diagram checklist is asked for because the test record had no for that question. For changes to the fictitious business name, go ahead and select no on the confirm no other updates question shown on the slide. Upload the LIC 4001 mod and check off fictitious business name on the form, and then go ahead and complete and provide your LA County DBA form stamped by LA County. And there's different links that are provided throughout the renewal process, so you can identify and see what forms we're looking for. For the fictitious business name, you can see it's the yes, no question where the yellow arrow is. For the additional updates, that's where you're going to identify the change. And then on this page, we have the different links. So you do have to file your fictitious business name or doing business as name with the LA County. The forms are available on their website. We do have some examples of the completed forms that are linked from the LA County website. Once you've completed the forms, you do have to file them with LA County. So our evidence that you've submitted the fictitious business name to them just needs to be that stamped copy that they provide back to you. To remove a cannabis activity, as you go through the renewal process, it will show you what activities are currently marked on your record. Any activity that is subject to renewal will have a check mark. You can't use this process to add activities to the record, but you can use this process to remove activities that you're no longer going to engage in. So to remove an activity, you would go ahead and uncheck the corresponding box. And then once you've deselected any activities that you don't want to renew for calendar year 2026, you'll click continue. You will not be charged renewal fees for any of the activities that you've deselected. Those activities will be removed from your record in the 2026 process. And if you had approval to operate, either an operating permit or temporary approval for the activity, that license will expire after 11:59 p.m. on December 31st of 2025, and you'll have to discontinue engaging in that activity. And with that, that concludes our brief rundown of some of the renewal options and processes, and we can hop into questions.
Good afternoon, everyone, and Jason. Our first question comes from John J. I believe that the modification of adding or renewing owners during the renewal process can be done for free. Can changing the location address or changing the entity also be done through the renewal process for free?
The answer to that is no. Both the relocation and entity substitution trigger the creation of a new application, which requires the payment of new application fees. So those modification types cannot be requested through the renewal process. And if you do request them, you will be assessed the applicable fees.
Additional question from John J. If license status currently shows as surrendered in the Excella portal, is it still possible to modify ownership of this license to renew before 12/31/2025? And can one modify the location address for this license? Finally, are we able to have the status change to reflect as active? And let me know if you need me to repeat any of those questions.
I will try to remember to hit all of the points, but if I miss anything, nudge me at the end of it. If the status says surrendered, that means that there's not an active license at the location. So that record is not eligible for renewal. So there is no renewal record being created. You can submit a modification request to update the ownership on the legal business entity record. And, you would be subject to any modification fees for updating the legal business entity record because you don't have a renewal in our pipeline to look at. If you're looking to modify the location, for this particular location, if it says surrendered, there's no longer an active record for that location. You would have to refile the record if you're eligible to. And as part of the refiling process, you could identify a new location and you would pay the applicable application fees. The status of active is tied to the legal business entity record. So if you have modifications that are being done to that, if the legal business entity record is under review, it won't be updated to an active status until that review is completed. And then for, licensing records, if you refile at a new location or at the location last associated with the record status will just be updated based on whatever workflow that record is at that time.
I think you covered it all. Thank you. And the next question comes from Kimberly S. The license entity has been sold and there is a new owner. Should we do the renewal first and then the ownership modification, or both at the same time?
It's going to depend. If it's 100% ownership modification, you'll have to renew the record first and then submit the ownership modification. If at least one of the existing owners is remaining on the record, then you can submit the updated 4008 form as part of your renewal, and then staff will review it. If this is a non-social equity record, it would not, of course, trigger an equity share review. So that ownership mod could be considered and potentially processed through the normal renewal process. If it's a social equity record and equity is transferring from the social equity individual applicant below the threshold to other people, which may include new social equity individual applicants, that will trigger a new equity share review. So you won't be able to do it as part of the renewal process, and the fees for the equity share review would be assessed outside of the renewal process.
This is a follow-up question from Kimberly S. In the same scenario where the licensed entity has been sold to a new owner, what form should be filled out?
Again, it depends on if it's a partial ownership change, which would require an updated 4008 form, or 100% ownership change. If it's 100% ownership change, we're required by statute to get a new application and process a new application. So, of course, if it's 100% ownership change, the business entity is going to have to submit a completely new annual license application, which is going to include all of the applicable forms for the annual license application process. So really, it's going to come down to, is it a partial ownership change or 100% ownership change? Partial will require you to submit the updated 4008 form through the renewal process. If it's 100% ownership change, you can't do that through the renewal process. You'll have to do the renewal and then separately submit 100% ownership mod, which will then trigger the submission of a new annual license application for the new owner.
This question comes from Ani T. Is DCR issuing temporary approval authorizations to new non-retail applicants? If so, when temporary approval is granted and a state license is issued, can the business operate without an operating permit?
So a business may request temporary approval once it has passed an initial inspection and received a state license. So to get temporary approval, if you don't already have it, you need to pass an initial inspection, which DCR would conduct, and you need to provide evidence that you have a state license for that activity. If temporary approval is granted, it allows a business to operate during, the pendency of them working towards getting an operating permit. I would request that, folks that have questions about whether or not they're eligible to request temporary approval, reach out to their assigned licensing analyst. Because if you may be eligible for temporary approval, you have that state license, it will be your analyst who would work with you to schedule the initial inspection appointment. And then if you pass the initial inspection and you've provided evidence of your state license, they would be able to add temporary approval to your associated record and get you the corresponding temporary approval documents. That process is handled outside of renewals. So for the individual who asked the question, it's going to be important for them to touch base with their licensing analyst.
This next question, similar, a little different, from Devin B. I applied for non-retail micro business in 2024. My portal reflects status of temporary approval, and I have been invoiced a temporary approval renewal fee. Can I operate when I get my license, or do I need an operating permit before operating? I thought DCR stopped issuing temporary approvals.
Another good question. Kind of the devil is in the details. So I'm going to answer the last part first. DCR stopped accepting temporary approval applications in 2023. In 2023, the state began to phase out their issuance of new provisional licenses for most activity types. So we phased out our temporary approval application process. We did get a code amendment through that allows for DCR to grant temporary approval, which is an operational status, through the annual application process. So if you've met the requirements to be granted temporary approval, you've passed the initial inspection, you have an active state license, whether it's an active provisional state license or annual state license. As long as you have temporary approval and a state license, you would be able to operate while you meet the requirements of getting an operating permit.
Our next question comes from Julio R. For license 425 form, must the applicant check the boxes that apply for all renewal cycles listed or just for renewal cycle beginning September 2025? He was not clear on the instructions.
So you just have to check the box that applies to your current status. So, if you haven't applied for your business permits or your certificate of occupancy, you can go ahead and just select the box that pertains to the September 2025 process. If you've completed more of the requirements that are in future years, that means you're closer to meeting the requirements to request a final inspection and get your operating permit. So kind of as staff are looking at the completed LIC 4025 forms, we're trying to figure out how many businesses are in different steps so we can work plan, how we're going to help those businesses request their final inspections and demonstrate that they meet the requirements for the operating permit. So you only have to check the boxes that apply to where your business is at, even if those boxes are for future renewal cycles. If you really haven't started the process, you can go ahead and just select the first box for the attestation for September 2025. And if you do have feedback on the form, because like the instructions aren't clear or you have questions, it would be great if you could just forward those questions to your licensing analyst, and then they'll get them routed internally so we can take a look at your feedback and hopefully incorporate it into future updates of the form.
Ariella J. asks, in the event a licensee already has a public health permit and a certificate of occupancy, how should they attest on the 425 form if the licensee already has a certificate of occupancy? They will not be resubmitting plans to LADBS, correct?
That is correct. So, the form was intended to be used on a go forward basis. So it captures the incremental progress a business will have to make to ultimately get their operating permit. So if a business has already progressed further than the initial step, they can go ahead and attest to that, and that will be sufficient. So if you have any questions about a specific business, please just reach out to your analyst, because hopefully we have that public health permit and certificate of occupancy information on the record. So that'll make it easier for the compliance team to kind of track whether or not that record is eligible to request a final inspection.
Antonio S. asks, I need more information and assistance regarding grants.
So our grants, so I have to assume that the person requesting or asking the question is either a social equity individual applicant or associated with a social equity business, because all of our current grants are only available to social equity businesses. With that said, to kind of ask more information, we do have a general social equity program email address. It's dcr.sep@lacity.org. And it would be best for you just to submit your question there if you need more information regarding, current grants.
This next question comes from Sebastian R. I'm currently in a divorce and assets are being divided. I previously settled a lawsuit with the city, but the settlement is in my ex-spouse's name. Will the department accept a court order granting me authority over the settlement with the required ownership change documents? The settlement has not been exercised and no license has been issued.
I couldn't speculate. I'd have to see the court order and then get it over to the city attorney's office to review what's included in the order. And then once they've had an opportunity to review, then I can talk to them about how that order would apply to, the legal business entity record and the associated records. And then, once I have that information, we would be able to determine whether or not we could implement the order or, what the next steps would be to implement the order. Whether somebody is deceased and we get a court order around probate and who the owners are. We have the successor of interest forms. Unfortunately, divorces happen and, there's a division of assets. It's hard to speculate to what may be included in an order or a settlement agreement. And without an order of those terms or those terms, it's hard to actually say what would be necessary. So the first step would be, getting the order or those settlement terms over to your assigned analyst so they can get them to me, and then I can get them over to the city attorney's office to begin reviewing.
Question from Jose B. When will DCR announce when the PCN process will open?
I don't have a tentative date. City Council took an action to suspend the issuance of the lottery. So, at this point, we're not allowing people to register for what we anticipated was going to be a December 2025 lottery. Generally, we open up the PCN process in parallel with the lottery processes. So the director is working with policymakers to see when we'll get authority to conduct a lottery. And once we get authority to conduct that lottery, most likely the PCN process would run in parallel with it. So at this point, I can with confidence say that we will not be opening the PCN process in calendar year 2026. And the timing for when it would potentially open in 2020, or we will not open the PCN process before the end of the calendar year. So there will be no PCN process in 2025. Opening a PCN process in 2026 would be tied to whether or not we have discretion to implement a lottery, and that's still an outstanding question. So I would stay tuned and bring this question up when we start the Q&A sessions again in calendar year 2026.
Here's a follow-up from Jose B. If the PCN does ever open again, are there any new community plan areas available since the last opening in 2023?
There are new community plan areas that are subject to a finding of undue concentration. On our website, underneath the licensing map, they have a table that lists each of the community plan areas. So you'll be able to see which community plan areas are subject to a finding of undue concentration. It also has the undue concentration for cultivation. They're just, two different tabs on the same table, so you can toggle back and forth. But that's where the most current information is. We'll be prepping those tables and the map again in October and getting them updated. And then we have the updated sensitive uses getting kicked in at the beginning of November. So, any changes or movement to the tables will be reflected in the next month or two. And we do aim to keep those tables up to date. So, when we do announce a new PCN process, you'd be able to look at those tables to determine where a PCN request could potentially be submitted.
Mike S. asked, if an LIC record starts with LA-S-40 and has gone through equity share review, are you able to do an ownership update to the LIC to not have a social equity owner any longer? Please note that the activities associated with this general question are distribution and manufacturing.
So the LIC record, the LA-S, the S indicates that it's flagged as a social equity record, which means it's subject to the requirements of 10420. You'd have to look at the legal business entity record. If the legal business entity record has a status of active, that would indicate that the record had gone through an equity share review at some point in time. You can submit an updated 4008 form as part of the renewal, but because that record is subject to 10420, if you remove the social equity owner, it will no longer, unless there's other social equity individual applicants on there that have the requisite equity for it to still meet the requirements of 10420, we wouldn't be able to process it because it won't comply with the rules. And if you are bringing on new social equity owners and you're removing a social equity owner below the required threshold in 10420, it would trigger a new equity share review. The activities on the record don't matter. If the entity is no longer a social equity entity, because general applicants can apply for distribution and manufacturing, it may be easier to either do your 100% ownership modification to remove the social equity individual applicant, pay the application fees for distro and manufacturing, and then wait for that annual license to get issued under the modified entity not subject to 10420.
Another question from Mike S. If a non-operational record has been updated to LIC, which means they have not conducted the initial inspection yet and do not have temporary approval, what should they expect their 2026 renewal fees to be?
The renewal fees will be to renew an annual license.
And the next question also from Mike S. Based on my understanding, DCR will allow ownership updates to be effectuated to the 2026 renewal application as long as it's not 100% ownership transfer without charging the associated mod fee. If this is correct, how would a licensee handle this? Should they just upload the updated 4008 form and wait for an analyst to request the required mod forms? Or would it be more efficient to have the required mod forms executed and attached to the front end of the updated 4008 form so that the entire ownership update packet gets uploaded into the 4008 field as a combined PDF?
It's gonna be cleanest to upload the updated 4008 form and wait for the analyst to request any additional documents that may be required. So, like if equity is being moved between existing owners, or equity is being granted to somebody who already has an ACA reference ID, and we don't have to do equity share review, there's not an actual removal of an owner where it goes to zero. That situation is going to be handled differently than if you are removing owners and we need to get the removal of owner form from you. So there's really no way to set up the automation to cleanly get all of the documents in as part of the renewal process. If you are removing owners and you know that we're going to request the removal of owner form, you could attach that PDF to your 4008 form. But it's going to be up to the analyst, because we have some analysts that are processing the records, and these ownership modifications are being applied to the legal business entity record. So the person who's handling your license renewal or application renewal may not be the same person that is processing the modification to the legal business entity record. So it would probably be the least headache to everybody if you just upload the 4008 form and wait for the analyst to identify if additional documents are needed, so that when we get the additional documents, they can get routed to the correct person and applied to the correct record. I think that's the cleanest way to do it.
My guest asks, if between last year's renewal application and now a compliance inspection necessitated an updated diagram, which has been submitted, paid for, and approved, can we attest that there is an up-to-date business premise diagram on the record?
Yeah, as part of the renewal process, to the extent that the updated approved business premises diagram is still current and correct, you could attest, yes, that it's current and correct, and you won't be prompted to upload a new business premises diagram.
Thank you. From Cody P, can a 50% social equity owner do an ownership modification to remove themselves and add another owner during the annual license renewal? And what if they are a 51% owner?
On the face of the question, I don't believe that can be done through the renewal process. The last part of the question hinted that the current social equity owner owns 51%. So if they sell 50% to another person, that's going to trigger a new equity share review, which means that it can't be done as part of the process. Based on the fact that 50% of the equity is transferring from the identified social equity owner, it's going to trigger a new equity share review, which means it can't be done as part of the renewal process, period. If there are, multiple social equity owners on the record, and we've already completed that equity share review, and the primary social equity owner is divesting of 50%, and that's going to another social equity individual applicant that's already been vetted and on the record, that will not trigger an equity share review. But I did not get those details out of the question asked.
And this is a follow-up from Cody P. If a licensee doesn't understand their own social equity and ownership status with DCR, what is the fastest way leading up to an ownership modification to establish their social equity status and the percentage of their ownership?
So there's a couple of ways there. The fastest way would be to log into your legal business entity record and look at the 4008 form on file. Um, because the 4008 form, the last one approved is what identifies who the owners, the primary personnel are, and what the equity percentages are. Once you've done that analysis, if you have questions about, you know, what the quickest way would be to modify that ownership, it would be to reach out to your assigned analyst on the record, because they would be the ones to be able to look at it and say, what you're proposing triggers a new equity share review. So you're not going to be able to do it as part of the renewal process. You'll have to renew the record and then submit the modification, or they can say what you're proposing could be done through the renewal process. But all of that is, requires somebody to go into the record to determine, where it goes in the decision tree. But finding out the information and what's on hand, you can log into the DCR licensing portal, go into your Elber record and look at the documents.
This question comes from Daniel K. How can I replace my predatory partners?
I mean, if you have ownership partners on the record, you would have to go through the modification process to update your record. DCR can't provide you business advice, nor do we get involved in business disputes. We do have signature thresholds to process ownership modifications, and if the entity is not able to meet those signatory requirements, you may have to seek judicial intervention in your business dispute. And, if you get a court order, again, we would review the court order and determine what the next steps are.
Our next question from Daniel K. Can I get help renewing my license through the grant program?
I don't know what, to the extent that the question is associated about fee waivers. DCR does have grant funds to provide fee waivers to social equity businesses that, submit their renewal record on or before October 31st. The amount of assistance that can be provided changes if a record is submitted after November 1st. In terms of like business advice, preparation of documents, etc., DCR does not provide that type of assistance to any business. So we wouldn't be able to provide that.
Our next question comes from Amanda M. In filing a change of owner, do separate modifications need to be filed for the change in owners and the change in ownership structure? And if so, which should be filed first?
Without actually seeing a completed 4008 form, I would say it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. Marking no on the renewal to trigger uploading a new 4008 form is going to be the easiest way for an analyst to identify what additional documents, if any, would be necessary to effectuate it. When you look at like owners, an owner could be an individual, it could be a legal business entity. You could have a direct owner, an indirect owner. You could have people who have ownership equity that are considered financial interest holders, but not capital O owners or capital I, indirect owners. Um, so it's hard to say, but you know, the owner could be an individual and an entity, and how that ownership is structured could have multiple levels. The 4008 form is intended to give us a view in, starting with the entity that actually is the applicant or licensee, and then kind of go from there with the ownership tree to get to the different levels. And depending on what levels you're changing or where people are changing, um, you know, that's going to impact the analysis for the record.
This a question comes also from Amanda M. Do ownership modifications for social equity owners have the same filing process than non-social equity owners? Is the processing time the same?
The initial process and review is the same. Um, if, as part of that initial review process, we determine that an equity share review will be triggered, that will put that modification request into a different queue because additional fees will have to be paid. Additional documentation will need to be provided. And then the payment of those fees and the processing of that additional documentation will add time to the overall ownership modification process.
A question from Kimberly S. Regarding site control, if an applicant is in the process of obtaining a new lease but does not have it yet, how do we answer number 2 regarding site control?
I mean, if you if you don't have site control through all of calendar year 2026, you're going to have to indicate that you will not have site control through all of calendar year 2026. Because what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to provide updated evidence um, for that. Now, you may have a lease that runs through January of 2026, and then the reviewing analyst can flag the record to say, look, we're going to need an updated lease here. If we don't get one before the end of January, that indicates that the business may have lost site control and may no longer be able to operate. If you're still in the process of negotiating a new lease or you've gone month to month with the landlord, we're going to want documentation or something to that effect. And, the individual analyst processing the renewal is going to be best positioned to work with you to make sure that we have what we need to timely renew the record.
And this might be the last question. I'm not seeing anything else in the queue, but this comes from Luis R. When will cultivation licenses be available for social equity applicants?
At this point, I'm not sure. The goal was to make that application type available in December, when we conducted the lottery. Of course, the mayor and city council have instructed DCR to suspend processing of the December 2025 lottery. So therefore, we're going to have to revisit when the cultivation licenses will be available. At this point, I don't have a dedicated timeline, but I do know that we do have cultivation license capacity in many of our community plan areas. And hopefully that capacity can be made available to applicants, if not later this year, it's sometime in 2026. But stay tuned for that question.
Thank you, Jason.
Oh, was that the last question?
It was the last question.
Well, thank you. Just want to thank folks for participating. Our next Q&A virtual lunch will be Wednesday noon, October 29th. Um, I expect that we're going to provide a little bit of information about the social equity program, some of the services that are provided, and give folks kind of a preferred order of operation for how to access different services. For messaging purposes, the low bono, pro bono, we're using different nomenclature now. We're saying low cost, no cost legal services because not everybody knows what low bono, pro bono meant. Also, for folks that are accessing those services, to the extent that they haven't created their entity, they're asking just general questions. It may be better for folks to reach out to the one-on-one coaches to get that type of business advice before they utilize their hours with any of the lawyers. So that's something that the social equity team highlighted that I will be discussing at the next Q&A session. So we just want to make sure that folks are utilizing the different resources in the most efficient manner possible. And, we want to be clear what services are available and kind of some of the feedback that we've gotten from our attorney partners at LACPA, and then, of course, some of our coaches. So that'll be the next focus at the beginning of the Q&A session. I do anticipate that the October 29th Q&A session will be the last for this calendar year, and then we'll pick up the Q&A sessions again in January of 2026. And with that, I just want to thank everybody
Jason,
for attending.
I'm sorry
Yes.
to interrupt you. We did have two more questions that popped in last minute. Are you able to take those?
If I don't have to go back through the closing statements, sure.
No.
Okay.
Okay, so this one comes from MS. Will DCR continue to approve license renewals for businesses that are delinquent on city tax?
Okay. I mean, we're gonna continue processing. Like, that is a difficult question. The code has no tolerance for folks that are not in good standing. The mayor's office asked DCR not to deny any renewal records that are not in good standing due to non-payment of taxes. There are different motions and council files moving their way through the legislative process. Of course, a legislative action has to also be concurred with the executive branch, the mayor. If the mayor vetoes a legislative action, then the city council could override the mayoral veto with a certain number of votes. But there could be legislative things that happen between now and the end of the calendar year that could change the response to this question. At this point, we're still operating under the status quo with the mayor asking us not to deny renewal applications due to outstanding taxes. If the mayor and council take definitive action one way or another before the end of the calendar year, that could change that. But for right now, we're just maintaining the status quo. We will get an updated list from the Office of Finance for businesses that are not in good standing, and we will be implementing some automation in the system to preclude people who are not in good standing from submitting modification requests and other things later this year.
And then I promise last question from MS. In previous Q&As, Jason has mentioned that Tier 1/2 Phase 2 applicants can become a Tier 3 applicant if an SEIA will no longer be an owner of the business. If that is allowed for Phase 2 applicants, I imagine it should be allowed for LAS-4 licensees that are not involved in activities which are exclusive to social equity applicants. Is there any way to confirm that 51% SEIA on a distribution and manufacturing license be transferred to other owners on the record?
I mean, it's going to result in the processing of a new annual license application in payment of new fees. because the record was going to have to no longer be a social equity record subject to the requirements of 10420. It's going to have to be treated as a general record. For records that are submitted outside of phase two, there is no mechanism for those records to no longer be considered social equity records. The tier one, tier two, tier three status only applied in phase two. Mechanically, if entity ABC was at one point a social equity business and they're only licensed for for manufacturing and distribution, those manufacturing and distribution licenses that were issued were subject to 10420. They continue to be subject to 10420 at the time of renewal. So in order for them to no longer be subject to 10420, that's going to take the processing of an application to have it be considered a general application. It can be done. It's just going to require the payment of additional fees. If you submit the modification request, staff would kind of look at it and determine, how we move forward. Right now, at this point, we're kind of working within the framework of the modification types, whether it's 100% ownership changes, and entity substitutions in the code. There's no modification type right now that exists that allows for us to convert a social equity record to a general record. So, there are going to be muni code changes that we, propose, but kind of the backlog of legislative proposals moving through Government Operations Committee would kind of keep that at the back end, and I don't think that they're going to take that up anytime before 2026.
Thank you, Jason. Sorry.
You're welcome. So with that, thank you for joining our Q&A session, and our next Q&A virtual lunch will be noon, October 29th, 2025, and that will be the last Q&A session for the calendar year. Bye, everybody.